Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Hands at the back if you can hear me. Great, perfect. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. James Brooks, the Melanie Trent de Schutter Library Director here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture. It's wonderful to see so many familiar and new faces here, and obviously also to be welcoming back Rachel Beanland, who is no stranger to our library and our collections. The VMHC acknowledges the Powhatan Confederacy and the Monacan Nation that inhabited the land where the museum now stands. We seek to honor that history and to maintain thoughtful relationships with those Indigenous people and to all the tribes of Virginia. Their story is integral to Virginia's past, its present, and its future. We also wish to acknowledge the generosity of former trustee Anne Worrell, who endowed this lecture series in honor of our former president and CEO, Dr. Charles Bryan. Now, before I start today, we're just going to run through a couple of upcoming events, so you've got those on your calendars. So first off, tell your friends and family, this Sunday, May 14th, there's a special offer for mums. Of course, it's Mother's Day, and mums will enjoy free access to the museum galleries, including our most recent exhibition, Apollo, When We Went to the Moon. So if mum is a lover of history, or you've simply forgotten that it's coming up, we have you covered. Now, a note for our members. On May 18th, 2023, we invite you to join us at Virginia House for the 70th annual garden party. And this is where you can enjoy live music, libations, and fancy food amongst the historic gardens. And if you aren't a member, you can just find one to tag along with, because guests of VMHC members are welcome to attend too. Our next in-person lecture will take place on Thursday, May 25th at noon. And Preston Smith will be here to tell us the story of his father's service in the Royal Air Force, which is the subject of his newest book, Spitfire, an American World War II fighter pilot in the RAF. One more thing, following today's lecture, Ames Russell of AR's Hot Southern Honey will be in the museum cafe sampling his line of hot honey products, so we're keeping up with the flaming theme today. This event is part of our series featuring food producers from around the Commonwealth. So stop by to learn more about the recipes you can make using his premium honey, to have a taste and even indulge in a handcrafted hot honey latte, which are scrumptious. So on to today's program. Today's talk concerns Rachel Beanland's hot off the press, The House is on Fire. The book is based on the true story of the 1811 Richmond Theater Fire and is already being called a stunning achievement and a propulsive, pulse-pounding read. The novel begins the night of the fire and follows four characters, white and black, free and enslaved, who experience the incendiary event from incredibly different perspectives. Rachel based all four characters on the lives of real people who lived through the fire and its aftermath. And in this talk, Rachel is going to generously share how she used primary and secondary sources, including archival material here at the VMHC, to bring these characters and others to life. Rachel Beanland earned her MFA in creative writing from Virginia Commonwealth University and calls Richmond her home. Her first novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever, was selected as book club pick by Barnes & Noble. It was a featured debut by Amazon, an Indie Next pick by the American Booksellers Association, and one of the best books of 2020 by USA Today. It was also named a New York Times Editor's Choice and was recognized with the 2020 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Her newest book, and the subject of today's lecture, is The House is on Fire. So we're so delighted to welcome Rachel back to the VMHC, and please join me in welcoming her to the institution.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. Thank you to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It is really fun to be back in this capacity. I just realized I never got instructions on how to use this thingy, but I'm assuming I can figure it out. It's just the little arrow button. So yeah, I spent some nice time here during the pandemic as I was writing The House is on Fire, and it feels very full circle to be back here again. So I want to thank you guys very much for having me, and thank you all for coming out to hear to hear what I have to say. I want to start this presentation by letting you all know that I am a novelist and not a historian. So everything I tell you, you should fact check through James later, okay? And in fact, when you're writing novels and you send them off to Simon & Schuster to be published, I keep waiting for someone at Simon & Schuster to want to fact check me, and they just do not do it. They're like, oh no, it's a novel. It's all fiction. No one cares. But I'm very, I want everything to be right. So I thought what I would start by doing is just telling everyone a little bit about the Richmond Theater Fire. How many people in this room knew about the Richmond Theater Fire before they heard about this book and this talk? Okay, so we're in a group of historians. Like the numbers are a little higher than usual. I would say usually when I give talks in Richmond, less than 40% of people have ever heard of the Richmond Theater Fire, which I find to be fascinating because, of course, it was this absolutely huge event in our city that happened, 200 and something years ago now. The Richmond Theater Fire took place on December 26th, 1811, in a theater, the only theater in Richmond at that time, that was located on Broad Street where Monumental Church is now. So this is on the left. If you're going down towards Churchill, it's on the left, kind of catty corner to the Capitol. And the theater there had been a theater there for several decades, but it was a different building. There had been a theater that burned down, and another one that was constructed in 1807. And so that building was only about 5 years old. It was, a brick 3-story building, could seat about 600 people, and it was pretty much at capacity on December 26th. And it was a very simple structure. We're talking, box seats, a large pit, dirt floor. The lobby was planked, very small, with a little ticket booth, one set of stairs going up to the boxes. There was a gallery for free and enslaved Blacks that had its own separate entrance, which of course wound up being a good thing in a fire. And then of course the stage was accessible through a stage door. So that's kind of the basic, diagram of the theater. And you can see, this representation, this engraving was done by a guy named Benjamin Tanner, who was actually based in Philadelphia. So it's unlikely that he ever saw the building. He probably created this based on, description he heard from other people. But it matches up with some other engravings. We see some woodcuts, and, I think we can kind of safely assume that it was a pretty simple structure. On the night of December 26th, there was a Charleston-based theater company that was in town. They had been in town since August, performing, multiple times a week. They had actually put on 24 plays during the course of this season. And they were about ready to go home. They were about to head back to Charleston. The company was called Placide and Grain. And they actually ended up staying in Richmond for an extra performance because they were waiting to rendezvous with a British actor who was meeting them in Richmond and was going to travel back to Charleston. And he didn't show up on the stagecoach. So they said, oh, well, we'll hang out for a little while longer. The play that they put on the night of December 26th was a play called The Father by Diderot. And so it was translated from the French by a local Richmond French teacher. And that made it a little bit of a local favorite, right? People wanted to go out to support him. And then at this time, there were, theater was a little bit different. You went to 2 shows a night. So there was a drama, something more serious, and then there would be a pantomime afterwards. And the pantomime that night was a pantomime called Raymond and Agnes. And that was your chance to get some laughs in. So the fire took place during the pantomime, so in the second performance of the night, and started backstage. And it's very hard. I'm walking a fine line here, guys, because we're here to talk about the history, but I don't want to give away too many spoilers in the novel. But it started backstage, and we'll go into some of the details when we get to some of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture's documents. But there was a lot of question kind of afterwards about what happened. But once the fire got going backstage, people had very little time to get out. The actors turned to the audience. They could see the fire happening in the fly space above their heads, but the audience couldn't see it. And so eventually they turned to the audience and announced the house is on fire, which is how we get the name of the novel. To tell you a little bit about, and I should say that, they announced this. Of course, it was very difficult to get out of the theater. And by the end of the night, 72 people had died in the fire. And 72 people, this includes 54 women, which is a high percentage of women. The governor of Virginia died in the fire. He had only recently been sworn into office. And then there was the president of the Bank of Virginia died in the fire. He was also a former senator. And Benjamin Botts, who had defended Aaron Burr in his 1807 treason trial. So there were some really notable people who died, but kind of the overwhelming story, for me at least, as I was reading, was the fact that 54 women had died. So that's a little bit about the fire. Now to talk a little bit about the novel. I had found out about the Richmond Theater Fire. I was very lucky. I found out about it the very first day I showed up in Richmond. So I moved to Richmond in 2007, and my husband had taken a job at VCU, and I flew down one weekend for a job interview, and a realtor had been set up to drive me around and show me town. And he was really just showing me neighborhoods at this point. I was trying to figure out where we might live if we moved here, and he was driving me down Broad Street and drove me past Monumental Church, pointed out the window and said, there used to be a theater here. And he didn't tell me much, just a few little details, but I was immediately enthralled by the story. And over the years, I would kind of, my ears would perk up anytime the fire was mentioned. And I was always surprised how many people I met who had never heard of the Richmond Theater Fire. In 2011, of course, we celebrated the 200th anniversary. So there were some historic organizations around town that made note of that. But overall, there are a lot of people, who don't know about it. In 2020, as James mentioned, my first novel was coming out, Florence Adler Swims Forever. And I had started work on another novel, something that was going to take place far afield and that was going to require a fairly extensive amount of travel to get right. And March 2020, we go into our homes, and I didn't know when I would ever get on an airplane again. I was trying to write this novel that was going to require this travel. And, I didn't know if I was going to my home for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, as we talked about back then, right? Or was I going to be there a year, 5 years? I had no idea. So as the months progressed, I started to get a little panicked that I might be in a predicament with this project I was starting. And so I started to think about whether there might be something that I could write that would be set a little closer to home. And that's when, of course, I came upon, I came kind of back to this idea of the Richmond Theater Fire. And I wondered if I could do something with it. I started, that summer of 2020, I started just reading a lot of secondary sources. And, I think one thing I absolutely have to do right now is shout out Meredith Henny Baker's nonfiction book. You can see it. It's the bottom one right here, the Richmond Theater Fire. She has spoken here before, actually, at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. So some of you may have caught her. But she wrote a nonfiction book that came out in 2012. And, it was one of the first stops I made when I was trying to decide if this was something that I could fictionalize. And as soon as I read her book, I knew that the fire there was so much depth to the story. There were so many different people who had been involved. As a novelist, you're always looking for kind of complications, right? Like you want as many complications as possible. And the fire, as soon as I started going deeper, I knew there were complications aplenty. some of the other books that I was really appreciative of were Gabriel's Rebellion by Douglas Egerton, Ben Campbell's Richmond's Unhealed History. These books that allowed me to layer the story of the Richmond Theater Fire with also Richmond's racial past, history of slavery. Because, one of the things that I think I kind of quickly realized was that my goal initially had been to write a novel about the Richmond Theater Fire. And I quickly realized it was also going to be a novel about slavery, that there was really no way to write a book set in 1811 in Richmond, Virginia, without addressing slavery, because of course it was woven into every aspect of life. So these were some of the, I have 2 shelves full in my bedroom, actually, which is a very unromantic place to store these books, I'm embarrassed to say. But this was another one that I just loved, that, you really have to be specifically interested in this topic. But The Richmond Stage from 1784 to 1812 by Martin Shockley. He went through, God bless him, every old newspaper known to man and documented every play that was ever performed in Richmond during that time period. Which actors were in them, what the reviews were from the crowd. I had a very good sense of what the theatrical world looked like in Richmond because of that. So, of course, eventually I had to get down to primary research, or I wanted to get down to primary research, and I did archival research a few different places, and I'm just going to give a brief shout out to Library of Virginia because, of course, we're here to talk about the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. But the Library of Virginia has a few documents that I would be remiss not to tell you about. One of the documents they have that is really beautiful is Charles Copland's diary, which is Charles Copland lost his daughter, Margaret, in the fire. And so the diary covers what happened that night, how he learned the news, the kind of all of the just trauma surrounding that. And then it also deals some with his grief and the community's grief in the days and weeks and months after. And just he kind of does a lovely job of charting his own personal recovery. In 2011, there was a local historian and attorney named F. Claiborne Johnson, Jr., who compiled a complete record, quote, a complete record of those who perished in the Richmond Theater Fire. And it's really, he made an amazing contribution to Richmond's history because it's a document, and you guys may have a copy as well, I think, but it documents everyone who died, but he gives everyone kind of a page and gives as much biographical information as he possibly can on each person. So that was one document that I accessed there. Patrick Henry's documents, a lot of them are at the Library of Virginia. And so I was able to look at letters to Robert Campbell, who was Sally Henry Campbell's husband. He has died by the time my book is set, but he's referenced many times. And I was also able to look at, childhood poetry and things that the girls, the Henry girls had written back and forth to each other, which didn't necessarily give me a lot of information, but it was just really charming and helped me kind of visualize their childhood. One of the things that the Library of Virginia has is just full access to the Richmond Enquirer, which was the kind of paper of record. I mean, there were a couple, but it was a very good paper at the time. And so, they covered the initial reaction to the fire. They had a comprehensive list of the dead. They would publish, in the days after the fire, they published all of the ordinances that came out of the Common Hall, which is like the version of City Council. So ordinances, and then also would publish things like medical advice, because of course there was no hospital in Richmond in 1811. So everyone had these burns and broken bones from, jumping out of the building, and then they went home or went to someone else's home to be treated. And so the Richmond Enquirer was running, giving instructions on how to treat burns and how to treat wounds. And in fact, when I have a sister who's a nurse practitioner, And when she read the novel, as a Word document before I published it, I was asking her, well, do you think, what do you think? And she said, I can't judge the medical advice because it's so far removed from, anything we would be doing today that I'm going to just have to trust that you got it right. And I said, well, I pulled it right out of the pages of the Inquirer. The Inquirer was run by Thomas Ritchie. He was the editor for many years, publisher for 41 years. He had established a bookstore in 1803 and then bought the Inquirer in 1804. And he shows up in my book as well. Thomas Jefferson said of the Inquirer, I read but a single newspaper, Ritchie's Inquirer, the best that is published or ever has been published in America. Ritchie was extremely political, and he advocated for many restrictions, more restrictions on free Blacks and the manumission of enslaved people. He served as editor for a very long time, and then eventually went to a national paper, the Union in DC, leaving his son in charge of the Inquirer. And the paper lasted for a few years after the Civil War. I use the paper for all kinds of things. I mean, this ad I use as an example. This ad was published around the time of the fire. And I actually begin my book with a reference to Curtis Fairchild. So for anyone who has read the book, you may recognize this, but I'm just going to read the first 2 lines of the novel. Sally Campbell's shoes are fashionable, but extremely flimsy. She ordered them from Curtis Fairchild specifically for Richmond's winter season. But now she feels like a fool for thinking she could get away with wearing them on the half-mile walk from her brother-in-law's house to the theater. So this is evidence that novelists really do put the research into their novels. I also use the paper for anything from trying to figure out, what goods people were able to buy, to how much the goods cost, to what the news was, both, around the world as well as nationally. In this time period, we have reports of a solar eclipse, an earthquake, and it's really riveting to read these papers because you realize how slowly news traveled. Like they'll have articles that will say, 3 weeks ago in Tennessee, there was an earthquake. And it just boggles the mind because you think about how quickly you would hear about an earthquake in Tennessee now, right? So let's move on to the main event. This is what we really have come here for. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture absolutely had the most resources for me to draw from for my novel. This is where I spent most of my time. And I was, I think I should say I'm extremely grateful to organizations like the Virginia Museum of History and Culture that stayed open during the pandemic. I know that had to have been an extremely big decision for leadership to make, to balance the need to keep their staff safe with the need for, historians and researchers to be able to access these materials. And, when I was coming in here, it was like we were all masked up and you were practically like running for the materials. And I would try to just photograph everything as quickly as I could and then get out, and so it was not a very luxurious it's nothing like it is now. Not a very luxurious experience, but the fact that I was able to access the documents is huge. And I know historians who have been working on projects that got really side railed by the pandemic and where they just had to wait, a year or 2 extra to be able to access what they needed. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about sermons. There are a number of sermons in, I'm so bad at the acronym, James. I'm sorry, Virginia Museum. I'm going to say the whole thing because I just can't, VMHC. There are a number of sermons in VMHC's collection, specifically about the fire, and they fall into a couple of categories. I think that the interesting thing about the sermons is that this is actually how Meredith Henny Baker discovered the Richmond Theater Fire, when she was trying to figure out if there was a story here, right, to write the nonfiction about a book about the fire. she was looking at sermons and started realizing that there were all these sermons that were referencing this fire. And she's wondering, what is this fire that all these ministers keep talking about? And then that eventually led her to the Richmond Theater Fire. So it's no surprise that in VMHC's collection, there are a number of sermons, and they kind of fall into a few categories. So there are sermons like this one, which appeared in, this one was given in Philadelphia. And this one was given specifically at the request of Richmond, by and large, Richmond men who were studying in Philadelphia, studying at medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. And so they, here you have to imagine you've got there was no medical school here. You have all of these guys who go up to Philadelphia to get educated, and they get this news that, that there's been this absolutely horrific event in their hometown, and they're too far away to travel back. They're, maybe in the middle of classes or not, but either way, they're not necessarily going to all come. And so they turned to their local churches for support. And so you get sermons like these that seem to be really targeting Virginians either locally or Virginians far afield, who may actually know people who were in the fire, may have lost family or friends, or at least are very connected to the community. And then you also get, this is another sermon that was also given in Philadelphia, where there's not such a strong connection. You get the impression more that this is a sermon that's being given, to anyone who is just grieving this loss at kind of a more global level, right? The fire really shook people up, not just in Richmond and in Virginia, but it really shook people up nationally. I think tragedies always do that. We hear about something far away and we put ourselves in that position. But particularly in this time period, there was this overwhelming sense that we were moving away from our values, that we were not as godly as we had once been, that we were engaging in things like the theater, or, cards or cockfighting, or, these various entertainments, and that was, kind of responsible for our downfall. And so a lot of the ministers were really using the fire in the same way that, it will happen today. They were using the fire as an opportunity to say to their congregants, hey, wake up, pay attention, right? This is a nice time to reflect on your life and on what you could be improving. So here's another sermon from Philadelphia. Here's one from New York. And this, you get this line here, at the request of a number of young gentlemen of the city of New York. And it's unclear, are those Richmonders or Virginians in New York who've requested it? Or are they just people who are kind of consumed with this event and want to hear more? You have to remember, we're in a time also where there are no grief counselors. There are no counselors really of any kind. So people were going to turn to their ministers for just help kind of explaining a tragedy on this scale. At this time, this is another one from Ipswich, Massachusetts. And these are all in the permanent collection here. At this time, we had never experienced a loss of life. In the country's 35-year history, we had never experienced a single day calamity that resulted in this kind of loss of life. So that, I think, really did shake people, regardless of whether they knew anyone who had been in the fire or not. This is a sermon that was given in York, England. So goes to show how far news of this fire spread, and how it proved to be incredible fodder for months to come. This one you can kind of get, I've got a little excerpt to read for you, but you can kind of get a feel for how the ministers were like twisting, news of the fire and using it to their own advantage. Because this one kind of suggests what the people in the building might have been thinking. And it's very fire and brimstone. They first query within themselves, can this gay company be composed only of professing Christians? Have those who are now acting their ludicrous part on the stage and those who are entertained at the expense of their time and talents be baptized in the name of Jesus? Have they vowed, or has it been promised for them, that they should renounce the devil and all his works, the vain pomps and glory of this world, with all covetous desires of the same, and the carnal desires of the flesh, so that they will not follow nor be led by them? For anyone who asks like why I didn't write the book with dialogue from 1811, this is why. I tried to throw in like a word here or there, but it's a little tough. But anyway, so lots of kind of twisting the meaning of the fire. In this particular example, they also list at the back of the sermon a bunch of other fires that have happened around the world to kind of further illustrate their point. Like, look at all these other and specifically they're calling out theater fires, to say, look at what happened in Covent Garden and Drury Lane and, all of these places. So we better get ourselves together. I want to spend a minute talking about broadsides. So, broadsides are these flyers or posters that were used to inform the public about, urgent news or events. And they could use them just kind of as announcements. Remember, information is getting to you much more slowly in 1811. So people could buy these on the street, and it was cheaper and easier than getting a whole newspaper, maybe, right? Like just one specific item. This one on the left is the one that regards the Richmond Theater Fire. I have it up against, there's a comparison to another broadside that was published a few years later about the Portsmouth, New Hampshire fire. And we believe those are by the same printer. They very well may be. At least there's kind of some mimicking going on. But it was this broadside, interestingly, we have it in several Richmond collections. I think the Valentine has a copy too. But it actually was printed in Boston. And in Boston, they had actually banned the theater for a long time. And it was only in 1793 that they, Americans were saying that this kind of the restrictions on going to the theater, inhibited their rights to personal freedoms. And so the council had relented and repealed their anti-theater laws. So this is only, 18 years later, right, that we've got this fire happening. So there's still people in Boston who feel pretty strongly about the theater. And this is an anti-theater broadside. So, and it's using poetry to get its message across. The poetry is not very good. I scanned it. I read every line at the time when we were trying to figure out a book title for the novel, because I thought, wouldn't that be fun if I could find a line in here? And it's so over the top and just melodramatic. There was absolutely nothing we could have pulled from. But these are, I think, really interesting windows into, this was produced. I mean, the printer saw an opportunity to make money. He was also making a booklet, which we'll get to a little further on. But it was an opportunity to make money, and it was an opportunity to kind of capitalize on this very sad event that had happened very far away. But I think it shows how much attention had been captured across the United States. To give you a little, I'll read you just 8 lines or something. Oh, what a painful, dreadful talk, which we are called to pen. When will the anguish of our hearts and furrows have an end? Thoughtless of every cheerful air, grief silenced every tongue. The tidings from a sister flute have all our harps unstrung. So anyway, you can keep reading at your leisure. Sometimes broadsides would just have reprints of newspaper articles. So we get some of those in the collection as well. This is an example reprinting, and this is a photocopy of an original, but This is a broadside from a Petersburg paper, and then the American Standard. So again, we're getting duplicates of articles. This was something, when we talk about being a novelist and all these details are great, but at the end of the day, I've got to write a compelling story, right? And that's the most important thing for me as a novelist. This was a document that I really had a lot of fun with. It's a court opinion from 1963 concerning the legal status of Monumental Church. And it includes the deed and the deed of trust for the land from 1814, the plats from that time, notes concerning the original Quesney's Academy, which sat at that location and became the first theater in Richmond. And then extracts of the Common Council minutes from 1811 to 1813. So the history is that, after the theater burned, the city acquired the land that the theater sat on, and because they wanted to build a monument to the dead. They had already buried the victims in the ruins of the theater. And so they wanted to put the monument in that location. And so the church, Monumental Church, was designed by Robert Mills, the same architect who designed the Washington Monument. And it was constructed between 1812 and 1814 when it was opened and consecrated. And Monumental Church remained a consecrated Episcopal church for 150 years. And then finally in 1965, it was deconsecrated. VCU Medical Foundation briefly owned it, and then eventually ownership was transferred to Historic Richmond, who owns it today. It is not surprising that in 1963, you have this congregation that's ready to move out to the suburbs, or all its congregants have moved out to the suburbs, and they're trying to figure out who owns this, who owns this, and what can we do with it, right? But it goes into all of the details on kind of how the land transfer worked in 1811 and who owned it prior to 1811. And it's a really kind of complicated relationship between the actors and then the theater company, because not all some of the actors owned the land, but then others were members of the theater company. And so but basically I was analyzing it, trying to figure out who had power, right? Because as a novelist, you're always interested in that, right? Who's got the power? That's where the story is. I knew that the city council, the common hall, they desperately wanted that land, right? And I knew that the theater company desperately wanted to be let off the hook. And so trying to figure out who had the leverage with this land ended up becoming a plot point with the book. I want to talk about these commemorative books that they show up in Richmond, but they also show up across the country and even internationally. This one was published anonymously, but I strongly believe it was Thomas Ritchie's print shop that would have produced this. It doesn't make sense for it to have been anyone else. These books, back in 1811 or 1812, you'd had this very traumatic thing happen, and then you wanted to buy a souvenir and keep it close to you so that you could remember all of the horribleness in, vivid color. So these commemorative books were very popular. And also, it's important to note that copyright was not really a thing in 1811. So all of these printers would steal from each other, and they'd steal from the newspaper articles that had appeared in different places. And they would just kind of assemble and reassemble each other's writing to create these documents that people could pay for and could take with them. So this book was printed in Richmond, probably by Thomas Ritchie's shop, because, like I said, he was a bookseller and a newspaper guy. And he was producing the books he was selling. So I think it makes sense. It begins with a narrative about the fire. This is kind of page one almost, a narrative about the fire, and quickly moves into reprinting an article that had appeared in the Inquirer. And then eventually we get to an ordinance, a reprint of the ordinance that also appeared in the Inquirer. This is the ordinance that passed literally the day after the fire, 11 o'clock, December 27th. Some of the things the ordinance is going into at this point are They're establishing the burial committee. They're telling everyone they can't run businesses for 48 hours after the fire. They immediately decided, it seems like maybe they could have waited on this, but they got right down to business with this one. No shows or public spectacles of any kind for 4 months. And if you did go to a dance or a play or something in that period of time, you were going to be fined $6.66. And so they figured that out right away. It seemed like their attention was needed elsewhere. I don't know. But and then they also gave the committee members permission to draw upon city funds to do what they needed to do. There ended up being minutes. Let me see if I may not have. Well, we'll get to this in a minute. There were minutes of a mayoral meeting that was held later that day where they established a burial committee. They established the inquest committee that would end up running this inquest we're going to talk about in a minute. They established a monument committee, which was run by John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall. And they kind of start to plan out the burial and some other things. So those are all minutes from these various meetings. There was a list of the dead. They decide on the funeral procession order. This is all stuff that ends up reprinted into these commemorative books. There was an announcement that all members of the legislature had survived the fire. I guess if you do not count the governor. And then we get more narrative. And really, it's like straight from that narrative that some of the stories we know the best about the fire come out, like the story of the governor, the story of Abraham Venable, the story of Lieutenant James Gibbon and Sally Conyers. Some of the more well-known fire victim stories come straight out of some of the narrative that appears here. The report on the committee of investigation, or the inquest report, runs for several pages. And I think it's important to note that the whole inquest took place over 5 days. Like it was done very quickly, and then it was put to bed. It was also headed up by Thomas Ritchie. So, I kept seeing his name around. It was like, oh, this guy's got some power. We know the theater company could not have been completely cooperative with this inquest report because there's an article that appears in the Inquirer later where they are trying to shift the blame and blame the fire on a slave revolt, which 100% didn't happen. I mean, they were just trying to throw stuff at the wall and see what would stick. And so, we've got, if they're doing that, we can kind of assume that they probably weren't being completely forthright with Thomas Ritchie. And then we also just get this weird report. And this is where, as a novelist, it's super fun that I don't have to be a historian, because I, read the whole report, and it's like I had a highlighter. I mean, I was going through trying to figure out, okay, who's where. These people were backstage. These people were on the stage. But the report is kind of infuriating because it's so vague. Like they don't name people. And then that, of course, led me to have more questions because I'm like, well, if you're not naming anyone, who are you protecting? Like, who's the inquest report protecting? So to give you an example of some of these vagaries, here's a quote from the inquest report. The man, we don't know who the man is, who raised it, they're talking about the chandelier, does not pretend to deny it, but pleads that he did so in consequence of an order from some person whom he supposed authorized to direct him. That person was behind him. The voice had reached him without him seeing the person, and he does not pretend positively to recognize him. I mean, this is the theater company giving Thomas Ritchie the runaround, right? Like, it's got to be. We have not the most distant idea that there was the slightest mischievous intention in the order. No names. We have no idea who was involved in that at all. Here's another quote. The lifter of the lamp says that he was aware of the danger and remonstrated against the act. Oh, the lifter of the lamp. Clear as day, right? Mr. Rice, the property manager, we get his name because he didn't do anything related to it. The property man of the theater says that he saw the scene was over in which the lamp was used. He saw the lamp after it was lifted up. He was aware of the danger of its remaining in that position and spoke to one of the carpenters. We don't know the name of the carpenter. Wouldn't want to put that down on paper. 3 times repeatedly lower the lamp and blow it out. So this goes on and on. Like no one is named for anything important ever. And that, of course, as a novelist, I'm like, well, why not? Why wouldn't anyone have been named? Ultimately, the report comes to the conclusion that the theater company is off the hook. They blame the building design for the fire. And despite the fact that the building was designed and built by the theater company is still completely absolved of all wrongdoing. So that just was lots of fodder for me. There were more ordinances in these in this commemorative book, and also, I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that Richie goes on to publish the personal experiences of 10 men, white men, no women. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But so we're getting a lot of personal accounts, sometimes of men who were not even at the theater that night. But then meanwhile, the women who were there, we're not hearing boo from them. This was another commemorative book. This one was published in Boston, probably by the same printer who did the broadside that we saw earlier. It's not nearly as thorough as the Richmond one, but again, they don't mind just lifting chunks of text where they need it. Boston in particular, because they were having this anti-theater moment, they covered the Richmond Theater Fire extensively. This is another commemorative book, this one from London. And they're borrowing primarily from material that showed up in a commemorative book in Philadelphia. This was a newspaper that I just want to show you briefly. It was published in Baltimore, and that was interesting to look at how other cities were talking about the fire. Because in Richmond, we had one way of talking about it. And then in other cities, they started to bring up questions that seem pretty logical. Like, hey, Richmond, why did 54 women die? What was happening there? And then the guys in Richmond are like, oh, well, you see, their dresses were made it very challenging for them to get out. Or, the guys were kind of coming up with all these excuses. But it was helpful to have these people far afield who were saying, from the outside looking in, it seems like something suspicious happened. There's some lovely letters in VMHC's collection that deal with the fire. This one is a letter from Elizabeth Hayes Ellison Dunlap to her nephew, Dr. John Hayes. She was in Philadelphia. He was in Richmond. And I'll read you some of it. I cannot, my dear nephew, describe the distress of mind we have all experienced on account of the awful calamity sustained by your city, heightened considerably by our fears that you or some of your family should have shared in it. Your letter just received has brought inexpressible relief. It would be impossible for me to express my sensations on this melancholy occasion. My eyes have been swollen with weeping the fate of the unhappy sufferers. Great God. And she goes on. She's very happy that he escaped the theater. I mean, I don't think he was there, but his sisters might have been. And then it's really interesting how one of the things that I became very fascinated with was this idea of narrative and how narratives get started. And so here's a woman in Philadelphia. She's writing this on like January 4th. And she's telling him the story of Lieutenant James Gibbons. I'm sorry, I don't know if his name was James Gibbon. Can't remember his first name now, and Conyers, Miss Conyers. So she's saying, let me tell you, all right, where are we? Hold on. Among the names of some of the sufferers I observed, Miss Conyers and Lieutenant Gibbon, who lost his life in attempting to save hers. He had got clear from the house and saved his mother's life with his own. And finding that Miss Conyers was left behind, he rushed into the blazing building in search of her and was never seen more. Both perished in the flames. Dreadful scene, horrors that language has no terms to represent. Well, she's telling a version of that story that's not the same version that's showing up in the commemorative books and other places. So it's like a giant game of telephone. This is just gossip at this point. She's not connected to these people, but she's in Philadelphia, and this is what people are talking about. Is the story of Gibbon and Conyers really captured the imagination, because Gibbon was a Navy officer. He had lost an arm And that's frequently not mentioned in a lot of the materials. But so he tried to save this woman who he was secretly engaged to at the fire. He was engaged, they were engaged aside from the fire, but at the fire, he tried to save her and was unsuccessful. And supposedly they died in each other's arms. People believe this because they found artifacts very close or whatever. I'm not 100% sure on that. But the story kind of took on a life of its own, that these lovers had died in each other's arms. And so I think it's very interesting to see that there are people in Philadelphia talking about this story on January 4th, and then other people in Richmond reading, various versions of it. This letter is from Robert Mills, the guy who designs Monumental Church, writing to Sarah Zane in Philadelphia. And he's writing about the design of Monumental, and also just the spiritual condition of Richmonders at the time. You will feel interested to know how the Monumental Church progresses, as through divine providence, I trust its use to the sacred duties of religion will be advanced. And he goes on to share a description of this altar painting that's going to portray the redemption of Richmond. But basically the theme is, I will not subject you to, because it's long and dense, but the general theme is that like Richmond was really on a downward spiral, what with all the play going and whatnot. And now we have been redeemed because we're going to put our butts in the church pews and do what we need to do, right? And then this last letter was actually addressed to Sally Henry Campbell, who became Sally Scott. And she also went by Sarah Scott. She went by a few things, but Patrick Henry's daughter. And the letter is not even very important, but it's just fun. She was one of the 4 characters in the novel. So for me to hold a letter in my hands that she also held in her hands, and for me to be deciphering the same handwriting that she would have been squinting at, was kind of special. Poetry came out of the fire. This is a monody, like a very long poem in which one person is lamenting another's death. Again, this was published in, surprise, surprise, Boston. And then we have a bunch of documents in the collection that appear in the years after the fire. So they were interesting for me because it proved that the fire, kind of remained in people's heads. It became part of like the collective imagination. People continued to be interested in it, but the narrative also changed. And so I just like the fact that the collection doesn't kind of end with 1811 or 1812. This piece was published in 1858. We've got this, there's this ghost story that was written in 1922 that's in the collection. And this concerns the death of Nancy Green. And it's still, in this case, there's a lot of rumor, people whose grandparents or great grandparents lived across the street from someone who knew Nancy Green, all that stuff, the kind of legend of the fire is making its way into these works that then are, here for us to enjoy. One of the things, and I'm going to close now for questions, but one of the things that I just want to kind of leave you with the idea of is that we don't get any documentation about what the women experienced in the fire until we start to get documents like this, like 90 years later, 100 years later, because the women left the fire and they wrote letters to each other, or they wrote diary entries. And it's only after they died and, that these letters started to be published in maybe genealogical societies or various kind of local publications. So we start to get some of that down the road. And that also became fascinating to me. There's so much more to say, but we're going to run out of time. So I would love to take questions. And I know we have some mics in the back. We've got 2 people walking down the aisle. So I'm here for it.
So any questions? You can just raise your hand. We'll come. Here we go. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
One of your sources is a broadside.
Mm-hmm.
As an old Navy man, I only knew that for shore bombardment or something. Where does that term come from, the broadside?
Oh gosh, James is probably better at answering that. I don't know. Do you know where the term broadside comes from?
I would assume it's because it's a broadside that's legible, easily visible.
Yeah.
That kind of
Yeah, I don't know. That's where like I'm a novelist and I can't help you. I can tell you about the characters in the book if you want, but no. I'm glad it exists. Yeah.
This is a fun fact. Our son was involved in a fantastic VCU theater production about 17 years ago.
Yep, I read the play. Yeah, and that's one of the cool things is that, you know, I like to think that my novel is like just sitting in this long timeline, like a continuum of art that has been created in response to the fire. And it's like people are going to keep creating art in response to this fire. I think partly because there is such a rich collection to draw from and we know so much. And partly because we're always, I think, going to be interested in these kind of large scale calamities because it forces us to ask like what we would do in a similar situation.
Well, they did it great. It was renowned and won awards. And it was really
Yeah, I wish I could have seen it. I've heard a lot of good things about it. Someone back there. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Just talk. I can't see.
Okay. I'm curious, as you said, this fire caught the attention of the country and the world, and ministers used it to question the need to go to the theater. I'm wondering if, particularly since some of your documents seem to have come from the North, and this would have been a little early in the abolitionist movement, but did you find any documents, contemporary documents, that attributed the punishment of Richmond, the fire, that is, to their embrace of slavery, the people in Richmond, and the peculiar institution? And in the North, they might have said, well, this is your punishment for embracing slavery.
I think there were some documents in England that did that took that approach. But yeah, I don't know if they specifically were calling out slavery, not to my knowledge in the North, because they were so consumed with the idea of just theater in general. I mean, Richmond did not have any theater for 9 years after the fire. I mean, they were very opposed, even locally. And then eventually it was people like Thomas Ritchie who got it back. William Wirt, Thomas Ritchie, John Marshall, like there were a number of them who kind of eventually, cooler heads prevailed and they were like, guys, we don't think we're going to hell if we build another theater. And so they tried again. But there has been some correlations there. Someone over here. Yeah.
Did any of the performers perish in the fire?
Well, okay, it's a little, spoilers are really hard. Like from a nonfiction perspective, I can spoil all day, but the novel, includes some of them too. One did. One person in the theater company did, but I won't tell you who in case you read the novel. Yeah. Well, I guess we need a microphone down here.
Had you ever done any extensive historical research like this before in your life?
So my first novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever, is based on a drowning that took place in my family in Atlantic City in 1929. I had a great aunt. This is Jewish side of my family. A great aunt who, when she was 19, she was training to swim the English Channel, and she drowned off the coast of Atlantic City. And that summer, my grandmother was a little girl, and they were on the beach that day. One of my grandmother's earliest memories was watching her great aunt, it was her aunt's body be brought back up onto the shore. And that summer, her mother, my great grandmother, was in the hospital on bed rest. She was pregnant. She'd lost a baby the previous year. And so the family made the decision not to tell her sister had died. And I had always been fascinated by that story. I knew that I had had this person in the family who had drowned, but I also knew that that they had worked together to kind of keep this story a secret. And so when I set about writing that novel, I initially thought, oh yeah, I'll just write this family story. And of course it involved so much research because I needed to get right, the Jewish community in Atlantic City. I set the story in 1934. And, I ended up doing tons of research on channel surfing and open water, channel swimming and open water swimming in general. Trudy Ederle and these women who had swum the channel in that time period. So the research went very deep. So yes, in answer to your question, I have had the experience doing this level of research before, but I still was not prepared for what it would be like to try to research anything set in 1811. It's a different level than researching Atlantic City in 1934. First of all, in Atlantic City, there were postcards, and you can kind of go on eBay and find like these little souvenirs and tchotchkes and whatever that will give you a really good sense of the era and what people were doing. There are very few images of Richmond in 1811. And so I really did have to use my imagination much more frequently this time, and the documents were all much harder to read than they'd been in 1934. And there's someone right there.
Your book has gotten a lot of publicity nationwide. As an author, how do you respond to that widespread?
Authors are all like, we're complete freaks. And so we can't even enjoy it. I'm like already panicked about the next book. And like, I'm like, oh God, what am I going to write next? It's gonna, no, I'm thrilled when the good stuff comes in, but you try to kind of moderate that because, well, what if I write the next book and good stuff doesn't come in? Or, so I try to kind of separate it and say, I'm going to try and write the very best book I can write. And then once it's out of my hands and it becomes this like object that you all can hold in your hands, then I try as much as I can to separate from it and say, okay, time for me to go do something else. And but it is nice when the good stuff happens. Okay, this will be the last question. And then I'm going to go upstairs and sign books in the lobby.
John Marshall was a Mason, and I'm wondering if there are Masonic elements in the monumental church.
And you know what? I don't know that level of detail. I think there might be, but I don't really know. Sorry. Okay, well, thank you guys very much. I will see you upstairs. Feel free, if you have questions that have not been answered, feel free to come grab me in the lobby and I will try to make sure I get to all of them. Can I take this? Okay.
Well done, Rachel. Thank you.